Okay. Okay, so welcome again to the first really practical webinar, and it's hopefully very useful to you, and we hopefully will learn from it as well, as we haven't done it before, but we are really keen for feedback so we can improve the webinar and also the data management form itself. So if you want to give us some feedback, please send it in so we can improve everything a bit better. Okay, so could I ask everyone please to mute your microphone so we don't have any interruption? And also, if you have any questions when we go through the form, could you please put it in the chat? And Karina, we go through the form step by step, and we will stop at certain sections, and then we try to answer all the questions. And we also produce a frequently asked question sheet resulting from this webinar and other questions we have received before. So you will get, or we will put it on the website or somewhere, so you will have access to it. Also, maybe it would be quite good for you if you would keep a copy of the data management statement form in front of you so you can follow it through and leave notes or whatever, however it is most suitable for you. And we really want to stress that the data management statement is not something evil HIPS or Historic England has dreamt up. Again, it is really for your benefit to have such a document. So let's start then. Karina, could I have the next slide, please? Okay, this is just a really jokey start of the webinar. It was tweeted the other week, so I thought it would fit to this. It just shows not only us are talking or thinking about data management plan or data management statement, it is really something the sector is, or the wider IT sector is having, and it is a standard to have nowadays. Next slide, please. Okay, why is all this? Where does it all come from? So it has to do with HIAS and the National Security Copy Code of Practice. This is concerned with the enduring long-term preservation of and access to England's historic environment records, and will safeguard this information for future generations. This is what the National Security Copy is all about. And HIAS signing up to this NSC are encouraged to embed best practice in a data management statement. Slide, please. So what is the data management statement about? You're writing down information about the system and software, the metadata, data security, the preservation of information and responsibilities. And you're required, or HIAS are required, to submit a DMS during the audit and or as part of the NRHE to HIR transfer. The next slide, please, Karina. Okay, now I hand over to my very super knowledgeable colleague, Karina, who is the absolute expert on this, and she will talk you through the form. Over to you, Karina, now.
Okay, thanks, Marion. Bear with me a second. I'm just going to share the form on my screen. Hopefully I've got the right. There we are. Okay, so as Marion says, we're going to go through the form section by section, and I'll stop before I continue to the next section in order for anyone to ask questions and for us to answer questions. So one thing that I want to say at the beginning is that the data management statement, we hope, will be complete. So, oh, hang on a second, I've got bad network. Can everyone still hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, fine here, Karina.
Okay. So it should be a chance really to involve the needs of the HIA with the IT section. If you don't have a close working relationship already, or if you do, to embed that relationship further. So really being able to fill this form in with the help of additional staff in the authority, and also as a way of awareness raising within the authority, perhaps in the wider department or team that you're in, about the HIA and its needs. So we'll have a look at the first section. This is sort of the details of the data management statement when it was produced, etc., etc. So a lot of it is self-explanatory. I do want to pick up on a few points here, though, just for clarification. And as Marion said, we will put frequently asked questions and a guidance form based on the information I'm putting across today to help with the completion of the form in more detail. So we've put a review date here, which we suggest is annually, because it would be important to keep this document up to date in the event that the access protocol of the National Security Copy needs to be undertaken. But of course, it only needs to change when things actually change. So we just recommend that you mark a time in your calendar or something like that, just as a reminder to check that this statement is up to date. The initial status of the data management statement will be treated as a draft, because when it's submitted, either as part of the audit or as part of the transfer project, then one of the HIPS team and possibly the PAO of the transfer project will review it and see if there's more detail required or if anything seems to be missing. And then we will accept it as a final copy following any changes, or if no changes are required. For the authorities covered by the HIA, if you have more than one authority, again, we encourage you to involve all stakeholders in the process so that they are made aware of the initiative and the National Security Copy programme and what it's all about. So we would encourage people to speak with all authority members where possible. There might be some related policies that contain some of the information that we ask you to record in this document, and we would try to reduce duplication of effort, really. So if you have a lot of information already outlined in different documentation, then please refer to that document when you're completing this one. So we don't need to reproduce the information, but you can highlight the document and then provide a copy of the document instead. So it'll cut down a bit of work if you have this kind of information recorded elsewhere. if you don't have these policies, then, as Marion said, it's a chance for you to have the information in one place, and it would be benefit for the HIR then in the future. So some people might not have visa documentation at all, and we ask that in this date of last revision, you just put in that you don't, the document doesn't exist. In that way, if you do end up creating a document in the future, then you can go back and edit this table to show that you now have the documentation. Okay, so I'm just going to see if there's any questions on this first page before we go to the next section. So if anyone has any questions, then feel free to ask. And Marion, if you could let me know the question.
So Karina, I have not received any questions so far. Just a question from me, maybe it's of interest to all of you. The revision required, how do HIAs, how do you know when the revision is required? Does it relate to the dates in the audit?
Yeah, so you might know that you've got a system security policy at the time of filling in this table, but you might know that it's not sort of up to date. So that's either because you've been through audit and you've identified that it needs updating, or HE have identified that it hasn't been updated for several years. So perhaps you need to review it and make sure that it is up to date.
So there's one more question from Robert Briggs. Are all of those policy documents mandatory?
Okay, so we recommend that HIAs have this suite of policy documentation, or that the authority has the equivalent documentation, and that the HIR is referenced within the documents. So in the business continuity plan, we know what the plan is for the HIR should there be, I guess, loss of access to network or IT failure, that kind of thing. So yes, ideally, each HIR should have access to equivalent policy within the authority or its own policy.
Karina, there's another question from Susie Blake. Is this an updated template, as the version I have is missing some of the fields, e.g. authorities covered and review cycle?
Yes, I think, Susie, you were one of the first to fill it in, and this is an updated template, and it will be updated again after this session based on the feedback. So it might be worth then looking at the version that you filled in and comparing what you might want to add on that. Because we put a review date of annually, we are hoping that we could send out the new versions within the year's time of when the HIR completed them, so that they could have a most up-to-date one.
And we will also put the up-to-date template on the website. Okay, Karina, there are no more questions. Maybe you go on to the next section, please.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so the next area is part A, HIR system and software. So I'm just going to give a brief outline for each section of the purpose of each section, why we're asking for this information, in the hope that then it helps you envisage the reasoning behind it, and therefore what kind of information would be useful to include. So this one's quite self-explanatory, but the purpose of this section is to know what software systems you use to access the data, who you would approach for help or advice in the data management and the management of the system. So that might be your IT department, it might be a third-party software provider. Knowing where the data is located, so is it stored on authority servers, is it cloud-based, is it just on a single computer? One of the main things is documentation for the system. So where does that exist and where is it held, in case it needs to be reinstalled or replicated elsewhere. And also documentation regarding the system itself in respect to relationship diagrams, if it's a database, for example, any codes or abbreviations you use within the system so that they can be understood by other people. Again, whether any licenses are required for any component parts of the system, such as the GIS or the database itself, that kind of information. So really just to know what it is that functions as the HIR, where it is, and is it documented. So if somebody fresh had to install the system, they would be able to follow procedures. Okay, is that, anyone got any questions on this section here? We've put in some kind of standard wording to kind of guide you through filling in this section of what we'd like to see. Hope that's useful.
I have not seen any questions yet. Maybe I hope everybody, I mean, I hope it doesn't sound too patronizing, but I mean, typing in the chat, I think that is quite, you just select the chat, so like a chat button up next to requests, next to the participants, and then you type in the chat at the bottom, but I'm sure everybody knows that now. Okay. Okay, Karina, then let's move on to the next section.
Okay, I'll go on, and if you do have something comes to mind, just add it into the chat and we can go back to it anyway. So I hope you can see this. Okay. So the next section, the purpose of this is to get an understanding of the volume and number of files that the HIR has and what formats they may be in. Particularly in the case of if the HIR needs to be temporarily archived with a digital data repository, for example, so that we have an idea of what it consists of and how much of it there is. We like to know if you have metadata for the files. Again, they're really useful for archiving, but also for understanding the purpose of each file, the method of compilation, what each file represents really. And also we've asked not just for the digital here, but some idea of the paper-based information sources, so that we understand whether there's a reference collection and where that's stored in case we need to consult with the authority to ensure any ongoing management or security of that collection should the access protocol need to be invoked. So you may already have an index to the reference collection created, so you're able to reference to that in here and supply a copy of that in times where we would need it. If you don't know, you can provide a brief overview of, you know, what type of files you have, where they're kept, and whether they're catalogued or not. in relation to the metadata, ideally we would like HIAS to have file level metadata. You could go right down to having entity level, such as the field descriptions for each field in the database, which is really useful. So again, it's looking at what information is available if someone had to receive the data set without knowing which file related to which thing. It might be called monuments data, but it might also be called something really random. So it's useful to have that information to know what you've got and what you're dealing with. I put some links to the metadata down below, and the Archaeology Data Service one is really useful actually. So if you go to this web address here and then click on their downloads, they've got examples for all different file types and templates that you can fill in to say, okay, if you've got a Excel spreadsheet, there's a template for that. If you've got a GIS file, there's a template for that. So I would recommend looking at those if you're not sure. They're very useful. Okay, any questions on this section?
So there are no questions so far. Maybe wait 15 seconds.
You have to type fast.
So, okay, there's a question from Ben Wallace. What do you mean by linked digital files?
Okay, so perhaps you have a report PDF and that's linked into your database to an event record, for example, or you have photographs that are linked to records in the main database. So they might be incorporated into a module or something and linked that way, or perhaps they're held on a separate server or a separate folder structure, and you've got a pathway link to the digital file from within your record data set. That makes sense.
So HBSMR entity diagram, that's what Ben said. Okay, oh yeah, okay, Ben says that yes, that makes sense. So another question from Giles, how much info do you need on the database model? If this is a standard database, is documentation of this system adequate, i.e. HBSMR entity diagram?
Yeah, sure. Especially where, like you say, is a sort of third-party system that's well documented. Documented? That's not even a word. Well documented, and they have entity diagrams and relationships and things like that. Then that's great. And of course, when you know that it's not a bespoke system and there's other users and other documentation available, then I suppose it's easier to point to links to that documentation, or we could get in touch with the software provider. But if it's a very bespoke system, say the only copy in existence, then obviously the more information about it that the HIR produces, the better, because there isn't anything else that we could replicate it from. Does that answer the question?
Brilliant, thank you, from Giles. A question from Elizabeth Williams. In terms of GIS layer files, do you need all of them listed, or would a geodatabase name be sufficient?
Okay, good question. The main thing about the GIS is to list those that are unique to the HIR. So say the HIR holds copies of scheduled monuments or listed buildings data sets as GIS, then obviously there's not the only copy of that data. So it would be to think about which layers within that geodatabase would be unique to the HIR and not available elsewhere. If you list that here as a single geodatabase, but then you have it catalogued elsewhere in more detail, like all of the layers and etc., then that's fine, as long as we know there's a geodatabase and it's catalogued and metadata exists to describe what the contents of the geodatabase are, then that should be okay. But I would probably say that layer by layer, file by file is better.
Is that okay, Elizabeth? Yeah, hands up. Okay, so I have no more question on this. Maybe move on to the next section, Karina.
Okay. So digital data backup. So again, the purpose of this section, as well as to know whether you have backups or not, is to understand about the currency of the last backup in case there is loss of access to data or loss of access to the system. It is possible that in the worst case scenario, the latest backup of your data would be held as a security copy until full access could be gained to the system itself. So knowing whether that backup's going to be sort of month out of date or a day out of date or a week out of date is quite useful. Again, knowing whether multiple copies exist of the data. So I suppose that would help measure the risk to the data. If we know that there's more than one copy held elsewhere, then again, that's added security. To understand really whether backups and viable data have been recovered in the past. So if someone did have to make a security copy of the data, we know that this has been recovered in the past. And also to see whether you have any documented procedures for data recovery. So having those information documented, the procedures and the steps you would take to reinstate data is very important. So as well as the table where you can choose the answers, there's also a small section here asking for a further explanation where relevant. And we are asking for information about the data itself and also the system files. So again, if it's a bespoke system in particular, you might hold the system files, the actual kind of building blocks of the system itself, to install an instance of that software. And they might be held somewhere different from the data. So it is important to document where all these things are in case a recovery needs to be undertaken. Again, similarly with the testing of the procedures, like I said, we ask to know whether it's been successful in the past. And I can go into more detail about each of these different scenarios, so recovery test versus successful recovery. But I think I'll just open for any initial questions first, in case they're covered in the question.
Karina, there's one question from Paula Allen. It's not about this particular section. She asked, which program components do you require? Sorry, it's a different section.
which program components do we require?
Yeah.
So we would need to know which components are essential for the installation and running of the software. So you might use additional plugins and things like that, or you might use a module that would run images, for example, that would be separate from the main sort of database style component. But so wherever data needs to be recovered into, so if you need to recover images into an image component, then we would need to know each of those things separately, if that makes sense. So whatever you need to create a fresh installation of the software, say on a standalone machine or a separate server or something like that, that's what would need to be documented. This kind of information might be documented already. You might have system manual, that kind of thing, which is great. So then just identify that in here to say this is documented in this manual. But if not, then we would really encourage you to document it somewhere, and this provides a place to do that, or you can still create your own separate document. That answer your question? I'm not sure if I went off on a tangent.
Paula, do you think that is sufficiently answered? Yes, thank you, she says. Okay, are there any more questions regarding the backups and so on, the testing?
Yeah, sorry, can I ask a question? I can't find the chat on here, so I'm doing it verbally.
Yeah, fine.
What do you mean by system files?
Okay. So the components, basically the building blocks of your system. So they could be like PHP, it could be written in Oracle, whatever program language that your system is written in. So I'm trying to think of an example now. So I guess that the execution files, if you were installing a sort of off-the-shelf package of software, you'd have the exe file where you would install the software from. So there would be those kind of equivalent things. So because you're bespoke, aren't you? So what is yours written in? Is it written in Oracle?
Yes, ours is in Oracle. So if we just said Oracle, that would kind of cover it, would it?
Yeah, but be specific about what your file names are called, sort of the order which you would need to install. So you might need to execute the Oracle first, or you might need to download it from a website. There's various different scenarios, I suppose. It could be just that it's in Access, so you just need to install Microsoft Access and then upload the data into a blank database, or it could be that you need to download specific other softwares in a specific order and link them together. I don't know. I think you just have to sort of think through what you would need to do to recreate what you have, which can be a bit tricky, I guess. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's good, thanks.
So I can't see any more questions. Maybe some will come later, but maybe we move on to the next section, Karina.
Okay, yeah, no problem. Okay, training. So this section we need to sort of adjust slightly because we had quite a few questions about what needs to go in here. So we realised that what we've written isn't really helpful. So this would be the place to record training of HIAS or other non-IT professional staff who have the responsibilities for these things detailed here. So digital security, storage, backup, disaster recovery, or business continuity. Obviously, if this is all handled by your IT team, they have obviously professional qualifications in these elements, but it could be that as a HIAS officer, you're responsible for making sure the backups are carried out. So you might not have had training in that in the past, or you've learnt on the job, or you might have had training in how to undertake this task. So it is just to reiterate that here would document training from non-IT professional staff who undertake these responsibilities. So if they're covered by dedicated IT staff, then just note that in here, and all is well. Okay, any other questions on that area?
There's no questions so far, but maybe I ask a question. Does anything about GDPR training has to go into there?
Yeah, I would think that would be one thing that perhaps all HIAS staff would have undertaken anyway, because it's referring to the security and storage of information. So I think that's relevant to go in here.
A question from Giles Carey. Are there any recommended training opportunities for digital data security in particular?
I don't know any that we would have recommend, like straight off the top of our heads. I would say to speak to your IT staff.
Yeah.
They would be in the best position to advise really on what's available. We do need to be carrying out these tasks.
Is that okay, Giles? Okay. Okay, so sorry, a bit of a cheeky question, but not a huge amount is out of there. It's out there. That's Giles' comments. Yeah. Okay, Nick Baldrini, would you like to ask a question? I can see your hand raised. No. Okay. Well, there's no more questions. So maybe, Karina, you want to get on to the next section, please.
Okay. So this next section of responsibilities is again where we would hope that you have been able to engage with others in the authority, and other people have some responsibilities for some of these areas of backup and data recovery and testing. Ideally, we'd like to see that it's signed by a senior management member of staff. So again, we are promoting and raising awareness of the National Security Copy Protocol and the relevance and importance of the HIAS data and the need for it within the organisation. We have had some people ask previously if you cover more than one authority, should you get more than one signature? And the answer to that is yes. And But if you have any more detailed questions regarding that, then Martin Newman would be the person to contact in that case. So again, it's just hopefully an opportunity to cement the needs of the HIR within the wider authority and ensure there are people that we can call upon in the event of a trigger for the access protocol. So any questions?
There are no questions so far. I just say that we had in the past few months colleagues or HIRs, they had problems finding senior management in the pandemic to sign. But if you still could submit your DMS, and maybe then after the situation has changed, this signature will then be supplied. That would be good. Okay, then a question from Jackie Pitt. What level of authority do you mean? Is county okay, or does it include district? Karina.
Yeah, we had this discussion previously, didn't we? That ideally we should engage with all of them. If you serve the districts, for example, through an SLA or any kind of agreement that you manage and record the HIR information for that area, then they should be engaged in the process of this, because they might have to agree to release some information within the HIR that covers their area. So you might agree between yourselves, perhaps, that they're happy with the arrangement that the county signs, but I think everyone should be, it should be discussed on every level, really.
Jackie said it covers districts, but we have no SLA.
I think it's better. Would you agree, Marion and Nick, that the issue could impact them in time? So if they're aware of what might happen in an event that the HIR is made unavailable, I think that's better, isn't it? That they're aware of what happens.
Yeah, I would definitely echo the idea of broadening awareness in that respect down to the districts. In terms of gaining authority, however, I would probably, if I were in the case of a county authority, if it were down to the authority that participation was continued, shall we say that if there was a danger of the plug being pulled, that it would be done at the county level, then I would have assumed in all probability that authority at that particular level would have priority. But I would go on, I would certainly echo what Karina's saying in terms of broadening the awareness amongst your constituent districts.
Okay, thank you. Jackie just replies, that makes sense, thanks. Another question from Cornwall, Francis. Can the signature be digital? Ben Wallace replied, a lot of things can be digital signatures these days. I should think this can be done like this. And I think we can agree, Karina and Nick, yeah, it can be a digital signature.
Yeah, we would accept a digital signature. I just think in some cases it's not been sort of policy of the authority to give the digital signature. Is that correct?
Yeah, maybe the advice will be check with your authority then. Okay, there's a hand raised by Nick Baldrini. Do you want to ask something, Nick?
Yeah, please. I'm just wondering, because we serve two authorities, and I'm just wondering what the situation is in terms of what you would be doing with the data. So, for example, if Durham County Council runs the HER, wanted to pull the plug, and this protocol was enacted, would you be looking to take it on completely over, or would you be, not take it over, but store the data, or would you be looking to devolve some of that information that's relevant to Darlington, who we cover, or is that something we should build into our end, if that makes sense? So what I'm trying to get at is that something you would expect us to have a plan for as part of our policy, or with this policy, would you kind of cover that, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that makes sense, Nick. I understand what you're saying there. I think ideally, if you have something set up at your end that would be, yeah, like a protocol or procedure, then that's great. If not, then we would need to know, as set out in the document, that there's the two authorities involved, and then if an event occurred where we would have to get in contact, then we would ensure that we're speaking to both parties, and then the kind of procedure and protocol would come out from those discussions. But if you did have something agreed beforehand in sort of like a disaster planning or succession kind of way, then that's great, because it just sort of cuts out that initial part of the initial discussions, I guess. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
And do you agree with that, Marion?
So there's just a little remark from Ben Wallace. I understand about informing all levels of local authorities, but this would probably be a brand new alien world to our districts and boroughs, and open up some interesting discussions. Yeah. Okay, Karina, maybe you want to move on to the next section?
Okay. Okay, so data security. Again, purpose of this area is to understand how data security is implemented and managed, and to, in the first instance, prevent any events that might trigger a necessary protocol. But then in the second event, if we weren't in a need to access the data, what systems are in place to prevent that from happening? So is there password controls, etc., that somebody would need to know about in order to get at the data, or any backups of the data? So again, we would suggest that these are documented so that people understand how the data is accessed, allow for parties within the authority to be identified who would need to be contacted. So some of these things might be covered in the system security policy. So if so, great, you can just reference that here and provide the copy. One thing that we would want to highlight actually is the issue of passwords, and where we recommend that more than one person has admin access to the system. But of course, you do need to follow your own authority's procedures and protocols in that respect. But if only one member of staff currently is able to access HCR, and they are not available in an emergency situation, then how could that be resolved? How could access to the data be undertaken? And in the past, we have understood that this to happen on more than one occasion. So there's a bit of a discussion about passwords, I think, to have. But of course, you have to follow what your authority's procedures are in that respect. Anyone else have any comments or questions of that? About that?
There are none so far. Wait a second. Okay, maybe we. Okay, Nick Baldrini, please.
Yeah, sorry, keep butting in. I just think for that one, if you're reviewing this, you might want to beef up the description in there just to cover a bit of what you discussed, because I think that would be useful, because I've made some notes, but it'd be handy to have that kind of written into that section in the data security, some of more what you said about the passwords and things like that. Just, you know, in the other ones you've got prompts.
Yeah.
Having some prompts in there might be a useful thing to do as well. So it's just a comment really. So. Yeah,
definitely, Nick. No, we agree with that. And going through this and explaining yourself, we've realised where there's sections, that, like you say, we could write that in. I think because we've had few of these, and it's just kind of something that's come up, and then we realised, oh yeah, that's not really explained very well. So yeah, we definitely will put something about that in there. Thanks for that.
So maybe you'd like to move on then? I can't see any more questions.
Okay. So moving on to physical storage. Again, the purpose of this section is to provide more detail of the scope and location of the HIA's physical holdings, and also, again, hopefully make those in authority aware, as well as others, exactly what is there, and where it is, and why it should probably be kept in an emergency situation until other arrangements can be made. So we also ask you to give these descriptions of where it is, where it's held, etc., and who has access. But then if you don't have a physical one, but you're in the process of digitizing it, or is being already digitized, then it's useful to know, again, where that's stored, where it's held, and whether any backups exist of that information. It might be that you've already been deposited in a secure location. If so, that's great. But if it's kind of waiting to be digitized, you need to know what's there, so it doesn't sort of accidentally go somewhere it shouldn't go, to put it in the most the best way, I suppose. I'm not naming anybody here. So any questions about this section?
So I can't see anybody. Maybe it's all very clear, this area. Okay. Might want to move on to the next one then, Karina.
Okay. So again, the purpose for this section is to understand if there are any restrictions in the data set, or any parts of the data set that are under restrictions. Again, it's not the intention of the access protocol to provide the data to anyone, such as an inquiry service or something like that. But there might be some restrictions that prevent parts of the data being supplied to the third party during an access protocol. So we need to know that here. So examples include the GDPR, but they could be examples of licensed data sets, found copyright in the data, any OS copyright or OS licensing issues, especially for GIS, for example. So again, it's just things that you might need to be aware of should access to the data be required. If anyone else got any questions?
There are no questions about this so far. You might want to move on then, please.
Okay. Again, if you're in the middle of typing, just carry on, and we'll come back to address them. So this section is one that we definitely need to put a bit more explanation in, I think. So the purpose for this section was to identify other data sets or information that need to be retained to provide business continuity in particular, or any legal obligations, such as you keep records for a set number of years, for example. Other requirements like any license agreements you hold for the data, any data exchange agreements, contracts or SLAs. So anything that goes with the kind of service of the HIA rather than the main data holdings, that would need to be retained in order to, or need to be referred to in order to continue to provide those services. But I don't think we've done a very good job of explaining it in this section. So we've had a few questions on this area. So I don't know if anyone's got any further questions on it.
So Karina, we have a question from Heather Hamilton. I think it's regarding the previous section, and she says, you mentioned reuse of third-party access. I assume any arrangement surrounding the portable antiquity scheme data should be included in the legal compliance section.
Yeah, so for instance, you can provide a copy of the past data that you hold because you're in an agreement directly with them. So that would need to be written into here. So we would understand that that's a restricted or licensed data set, and so that we shouldn't provide a copy of that to someone else. Exactly.
Is that okay, Heather? Yes, thanks. Okay. Couldn't see any more questions. Maybe it will come later, and maybe Karina, you want to move on then?
And so we're nearly at the end of the form, really. So this is the last section of the form, and then what we have is a couple of appendices. So they're kind of hopefully self-explanatory, but the appendix 1 is for the data and file recovery log. So we encourage that if there is any incident or event where you needed to recover either the whole data or parts of data, we encourage you to keep a record of that. Again, it gives indication to the stability of the database, level of risk, etc. So we have provided an appendix here, an example template which you could use, or you might have already another way of recording this information. Also with the recovery, we recommend that that's carried out regularly. and it would be an example where a test scenario where every 6 months or every year a copy of the backup would be taken and used to test the recovery procedure to demonstrate that it can be done successfully without loss of data or corruption of data, or the system just falling over and refusing to import the data. So that undertakes in a, that wouldn't be as a result of a sort of real life incident where you needed to recover data. That would be a separate test scenario, and ideally that would be made in a copy of your system, so you don't overwrite your current information. And again, if you do need to build up a bespoke system, then you would ideally do that as part of the recovery as well. So you would test that, okay, here's my system files, I'm installing and building the system, and then I'm taking a backup of data and putting that into there as a test scenario. So that's where this kind of information would be recorded to see that they've been successful. If they haven't been successful, maybe changes need to be made, maybe it needs to be more adequately documented, etc., etc. Appendix 2 is the training log, which relates back up to the training section above. So again, it would be for the non-professional IT staff to list where they've undertaken any training, such as GDPR, or perhaps you've undertaken some in-house training as well on your security and password procedures. That kind of information can be recorded in here, but of course you might have your own CPD or other training log that you manage, which can be used instead. So these are just sort of some template examples where you could use to record that information. Okay, so that's sort of the end of the form as it is, but please feel free to ask any other questions of issues we haven't touched on or covered, anything at all.
I have a question from Rona. It may not be possible to have a copy of the system in which to carry out a test, as licenses for software may not allow for an additional setup.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, that makes perfect sense. Is it? I would have to say to speak to your IT people then, of how you could test a successful backup. So is it that a separate instance of the data set can be made within the system, so you don't have a separate system, but when you load data into your system, it doesn't overwrite your current information because you don't want that to happen? Or is it possible to test the data through another system? I think you need to speak to your IT really of how you could get the best out of that scenario. Like I said, what I described was a very ideal scenario, but the main thing is testing that you can get the data into a workable situation and you can review the data as well. I'd say that it's important that an HIAS member of staff gets to review the results of these test recoveries to see that the data makes sense and that there aren't chunks missing and things like that, because an IT person could like load it in and said, yeah, the file's open, it worked, but it really takes an HIAS to know that the data that you want is there and it's readable and is not gone corrupt in any way.
Okay, Rona says it's okay. She will take advice from IT. There's a comment from Giles. I don't like to hang on about training, but it would be really useful to have some training resources flagged up, if possible. Our IT service aren't well set up to provide such training internally. Okay. Mark has raised a hand. So, Mark, would you like to ask a question?
Hello, thank you. It's okay, I can't find the chat function either, so I thought I'll just put my hand up and ask verbally. In terms of the form, I can see sort of from the discussion that's taken place so far that there's going to be a few sort of modifications to the text that's inside the template and stuff like that. So once that has happened, will we be all sent a new version that we can then fill in? Or will we have some sort of an email to tell us that the new version is available for us to download from somewhere? Because otherwise, if we start editing an older version and then it's going to change, we're going to have to do all the work again.
Yeah, hi, Mark. The version itself, there'll be a few changes to. There'll be minimal, but what will be supplied would be a kind of another document that would act as a guidance document. So it would be more information written into the document, which will help you then fill in the template of the DMS. But of course, yes, we will upload these onto the website, and where relevant, I will send them directly out to people as well, or inform you that it's now available on the website to download.
Okay, that's great. That's brilliant.
Is there any issue with the website at the moment?
No. We can upload it. Okay. We can upload it as soon as we've made changes.
Yeah. So, like I said, what I'm hoping is we'll tweak the template slightly, but the main body of detail that we've been discussing today will be put into a sort of separate guidance document, just not to sort of overcrowd the template, if that makes sense.
Okay, yep. I'll wait until I see that information before I actually start on this, because I'm going to have to sort of consult with quite a few people across the authority to get the bits of information I need, I think.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
Ben, would you like to say something, or?
Yeah, hi. It was relating to Mark's point, actually. I think this is a really interesting one. Maybe we need to come up with a sort of procedure that we follow, because from my mind is what we've got now is good enough as sort of, you know, a minimum amount of information to understand what is needed to sort of recreate the HIR somewhere and sort of salvage it and understand it. So I would say, shouldn't we just be using this template now, filling it in now? Yes, we might have some changes in a month. We might also have some changes to the template in 3 months after some projects take place, and also some changes in 6 months or a year, because this is very new stuff. You know, we've got a lot of ideas and development going on. We don't have that many compared to how many HERs there are right now. And isn't this part of the review process as well? If we're going to review these every year and we've got a date, part of the review process is there a new template? Right, let's use the new template then. I'm just thinking, if we keep on waiting for the next iteration of the template, well, you could keep on waiting and waiting and waiting, and every few months we'll add another section in the form or guidance. And that's not to dismiss what you're saying, Mark. I completely understand that, you know, we've got to go to a lot of different people and get the information and gather it. And the last thing we want is to have to go back to them in 3 months' time and say, oh, I forgot to ask you this. But I'm just wondering, the idea of this is this sort of backup recovery, national security copy. You know, what happens if things fail? And, you know, yeah, I'll stop there.
I think that was a really good comment, Ben. That's really great.
Yeah, Ben, definitely, because like you say, there may be revisions needed following the field test recovery project and things like that, which we are thinking about. So as I said, the ones to this template will be very minimal to just the wording. So it's not going to affect the information that people are filling in as of today. But we'll put that guidance document, which will hopefully explain things a bit more. And as you suggested, when they revise, review the document annually, then we check if there's a new version to record again. So I think that's a good plan.
Karina, there's another question from Robert Briggs. It says, do you have in the stipulation expectations about physical storage standards and locations? We are soon to be booted out of our current office, and it's looking as if a lot may end up separated from us in offsite storage. A lot of our hard copy resources.
Yeah, that's a good question. Mary and Nick, I don't know if you would agree that that is something that we assess through audit. Yeah. So we would, look at those standards and recommendations through the audit process rather than through this form.
I think what we'd be looking for in this form would be primarily details as regards where we could find the reference collection in the event of an emergency scenario. In terms of its storage, we make reference to the British Libraries standards within the audit process itself, but that's basically something that the HIAS officer will have to be dealing with on site, as it were. In terms of reference collection, how we would define a reference collection is the material that the HIAS requires on a day-to-day basis to support its advice. And so consequently, if it is being made remote or separated from that collection, I think you've got to start querying, well, certainly you've got to start looking at digital scanning if it is to serve the purpose of a day-to-day aid. But if you are sort of getting away with getting rid of this stuff and you are actually not using it on a day-to-day basis, it isn't part of your bread and butter service, then possibly it isn't actually a reference collection, perhaps it's more backlog, and perhaps you've got to start looking at the definition and redefining some of the material you've got. Those would be my thoughts anyway.
Robert, you've raised your hand. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yes, mainly because you refer to the audit. We have one booked in for October of 2022, but our offices are closing at the end of this calendar year. So what I was trying to hope was, my intention, my aspiration is that we design the best possible outcome, even in the worst case scenario, that we do lose all our physical resources, some of which, as Nick's just said, we don't use and can definitely be scanned or disposed of perhaps, but others we use on a daily basis, a weekly basis. And so I'm just trying to hopefully get from you guys some kind of standard that I can then feed into discussions that we're soon to have about how we actually design our new workspace and our new work arrangements.
In terms of what you've done in your previous audit, my assumption would be that you will have made an assessment of the importance of this reference material to the service. And so consequently, that may help you some way down the business of defining what is a reference collection and what is perhaps more loosely be defined as a backlog. I think you've got to make quite a clear case to your host authority relating to the material that you would consider essential to your day-to-day work, in order that you've got to make the case that you cannot be separated from it without it actually impacting upon the service that you provide to your users.
I mean, that's very much the tack we'll be taking. It's getting on late October and we still haven't had a conversation, even though it's 2 months and a little bit to go. I just kind of wondered if there was any sort of, we've been talking about policy, whether sort of something documented around that at your side we could just, you know, point to as a this is a national standard that we need to adhere to, as well as having our own county level policies and practices?
If you look at the HIR guidance document, which I think is generally available, this will make specific reference, well, it makes specific comments regarding a reference collection. Our own take on things is largely one of physical proximity. It's either going to be digitized, which means you can get hold of it remotely, or the reference collection will be physically close to where the HIR is based in terms of its office space. Once you start putting it into remote storage where it is not going to be immediately accessible, then if that impacts upon the service that you are providing, then that is certainly something that we would certainly support your case for having a reference collection. Let's put it as shortly as that. And you will find reference to that collection within the HIR guidance. I think how you define a reference collection and how you distinguish that from a backlog, well, that's another issue, but I would suggest that comes down to a question of importance, and that is something that you should have addressed during the course of your last audit.
Fantastic, thanks for that.
Okay, so there are two more questions from Ben Wallace. Where in the form would record the current computer broad system setup, operating system, standard programs, system files that are needed for the HIR database to run? So for example, for us, it would be Windows 10, 65-bit, Office 365, 64-bit access, also minimum PC hardware requirements, server requirements. Would that be in part A?
Hi, Ben. Yeah, it's going to be recorded in your system documentation or your system manual anyway, which you can reference in here, but otherwise you can record it in the very first section in the part A, the HIR system and software, this section here. I don't know if you can still see my screen.
Yes.
But hopefully, if you've got other system requirements documentation, then it will be recorded in there. But yeah, you're right. You're saying, okay, it won't work if you try to use it on this machine. So don't try and do that.
Great. And another one from Ben. Where do we record the information about other places where our data is regularly shared, e.g. Heritage Gateway, our own online website, WMS, WFS service, etc.?
Okay, that's a good question. I'm just trying to think which of the policies is it in the recording policy? Right.
Where I was going with that was if, for example, the HIR gets removed from our host authority and gets placed somewhere else, you've got these other attached services that are relying on regular updates, you know, either overnight copies that are being made to Heritage Gateway or direct links or internal GIS systems that are using these sort of services. And suddenly if it's just gone and disappeared, they'll fail, you know, or they won't get used anymore. Now, I appreciate that some of these are sort of longer term, you know, sort of copies of data rather than sort of daily or instant. But I was just trying to think it through about what the impacts are on some of these other systems that might already be directly connected into the HIR if that database structure is sort of removed and placed elsewhere. And I'm wondering, should that be recorded in the DMS or like you were thinking, is that in another piece of documentation somewhere? But I'm thinking in the DMS it might be quite useful because that's the sort of thing we want to know about at the time, rather than have to hunt in a different document where that information might be stored. I am sort of thinking out loud, really, but
yeah, I think it's a good point, Ben. I think, as you say, that because that would form like the next stage, really, the next part of the conversation we have about, okay, we've got a copy of the data, it's secure, but then put in the kind of services back into operation and that kind of thing. It's kind of like, yeah, the next step on, but you are right, it'd be useful to know that, and I guess maybe at the moment we haven't accounted for that. No excuses here, just yeah, or it could be documented in other things like information services policy or recording policy or something that says, okay, we provide information via these outlets, you know. But yeah, I think it's a good point, something to think about, definitely. When we think about it, I'm not 100% sure.
That's okay. I mean, this is really interesting stuff, and it's just sort of got me thinking a bit more about what would happen if you have to sort of move an HIR somewhere, or everything it's connected to, and that's part of this process, isn't it? We're trying to work it through, and of course we haven't done it yet, so we're you know, it's sort of trying to guess ahead of the game what you would need when it happens. Yeah. I think, yeah, thanks.
So any more questions or comments, or if you don't want to put it in the chat, you can also talk to us. I mean, we're at the end of our webinar, really. Okay, maybe not then. Karina, do you, Nick, would you like to say anything?
No. Very pleased everybody could participate. I've had enormous fun. Thank you.
Yes, okay, well, if there's no other, okay. Thank you, Ben. Very good, thank you. So many thanks to Karina to guide us through this form, and many thanks for all your questions and comments. I'm sure we can improve it now, and it really helped us what you think about this, and because you have to fill it in, and it's for you really. So many thanks for joining us, and if you think you would benefit from other kind of webinars, some practical sessions, please drop us an email or somehow, and we'll be happy to accommodate it. It's now so easy in this virtual world from working from home, and so we can easily put something up, providing we know the answer. Okay, then I stop recording now.
Yeah.